Thank you for joining us today. Welcome, everyone. My name is Sarah Altendag, and I am the Senior Manager of Communications and Marketing here at Kids & Company. I want to thank you all for joining today's webinar. We would like to welcome Brain Power Instructor Joel Benabu and moderator Sarah Meehan, and author and radio producer Vanessa Iarocci, CEO of Brain Power. Brain Power is an after-school enrichment program that caters to the needs of high-achieving students. Today, Joel and Vanessa will be exploring 6 high-potential learners, how to identify them, and their unique learning needs. The goal is for their parents and caregivers to better understand how their own children learn and to provide you with tools that can help you unlock your children's hidden potential. We are so thrilled to have Joel, Vanessa, and Sarah join us today. If you have any questions throughout your session, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will ensure that they will be addressed at the end of the session. So over to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Sarah. First, I would just want to mention that my mother swears there were no other baby Sarahs around the year I was born, and yet my daily encounters have led me to doubt the veracity of this claim. Welcome everyone to our conversation today on filling the gaps in learning as we help kids reach their true potential. Whether your kids are still very, very small, which I'm sure most of them are, or school-aged like mine, it's something that we're all thinking about, especially at this, pretty critical time in education. I think you're going to get a lot of helpful information and material from this discussion, and I'm very excited to be here. So let me first tell you what we're going to be talking about today. First up, we'll talk about some of the issues facing our high potential underachieving kids, including what their needs are and how they have arisen. Next, we'll talk about how you as parents can recognize high potential learners who might be slipping under the radar. And that's where we'll talk about these 6 profiles and how educators like the ones at Brain Power cater to the needs of these kids and bridge the gaps in our education system that, as we know, is under incredible strain. But first, we'd like to start with a little bit of a personal story. It's something I think you might be able to relate to as a working parent. So Vanessa, could you begin by telling us how parenting a son who was sort of cast as an average learner led to the position that you're in now?
Certainly. And hello, everyone. Yes, so this story about brain power for me begins as a personal story. And that story began, I have a son. He's now 15. And as moms, I think we all doubt our own instincts about our children. And I saw Marco growing up, and he was this really creative, thoughtful, reflective child. He had these very diverse interests. He was very interested in history, and he was constantly watching documentaries and asking me really deep questions about life and history and the world. But I was always really surprised that what came back in his report cards was frankly that he was a little bit average or below average. And I thought that, that's fine if that's who he is. But around midway through elementary school, I actually decided, largely because I was so burned out as a working mom in a 2-income household, to get him a tutor. And I solicited the advice of an actual expert educator with a PhD who had done a lot of research on kids and learning and worked with high potential kids. And she worked with Marco directly and through one-on-one interactions with him that really focused on giving him the confidence and the tools he needed to succeed. Within 2 to 3 months, he went from being average to way above average, and being accepted into a pretty competitive high school. And so what I learned from that whole exercise is that with the right guidance, you may unearth opportunities that exist in your child that you might not realize as a parent, and that even a teacher who's very overburdened with running a classroom with 30 kids might not be able to unearth. And I thought this changed our lives as a family. And I thought, there should be like a place families can go to get the service. And it just so happened, I'm not sure if it was karma, Brain Power does just that. And they were looking for an expansion partner and a CEO. And, the rest is history.
Thank you, Vanessa. And you know what? I want to get a little bit more into some of the high potential characteristics and signs that you may have missed when he was growing up, and how his educator drew them out. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But first, Joel, I want to go over to you. Can you help us define what's going on here more generally? Why are high potential learners like Marco so often falling through the cracks?
Absolutely. Let me just start by thanking Kids & Co. for this wonderful collaboration. I really hope that this is, the first of many. And of course, before answering your question, I also want to thank our audience members, right, who have taken precious time out of their busy schedule to join us today. I think that, it's fair to assume that most of the audience today comprises, parents like Vanessa, like Sarah, like myself, who are rightly concerned about the state of their children's education in this, precarious time. So please know that we appreciate your participation tremendously today. Now let me get back to you answering your question. So I think that there are several forces at play here that are impacting negatively on the learning of high potential kids like Marco. Perhaps the most obvious is cuts to education funding on the provincial level, and changes that have been made to specialized programs in public schools, such as TOPS and MAX. And Vanessa, feel free to jump in if you want to provide any more details. You're far more qualified to talk about these changes than I am. Now, clearly, parents and teachers are burnt out from having to deal with the immense challenges that COVID-19 has placed on all of us. I am going to share this because I think that it is indicative of the challenge that quite a number of us face. I happen to come from a family with a member who has a condition. So the challenges were huge for me, having to work both at U of T and at Brainpower, taking care of a loved one, and having to look after my two boys who are 9 and 6. Trying so hard to understand how the online Zoom technology works, and realizing that many of my kids' teachers were having a very, very hard time navigating 8 hours on Zoom, left me, as I'm sure it has left many of us, clutching for straws and feeling really, really, really drained from this experience. And finally, I want to touch upon one other thing that I think we don't tend to discuss very often, and that is the fact that many of our kids, I think, suffer a great amount of anxiety when it comes to, leaving our COVID pod, and becoming social once again. I think that there's a huge amount of pressure that is placed on kids. And I think that there's also a great deal of fear, both on the part of kids and parents, as to how they're going to be able to catch up academically. So I hope that I was able to demonstrate that there's some sort of serious issues at hand, and we are all committed, as I'm sure many of the parents that are listening here, to try to address those issues and to solve them in the future.
And one thing that you made me think about, Joel, was a very clear evidence of how difficult things have been for our students is the recent release of the standardized test results. Vanessa, was that just this past week?
Yes, just earlier this week. If you read any major news media in Canada, you may have seen it. The EQAO, which is our provincial standardized testing in grade 3 and grade 6, dismal results. So 60% of grade 6 students in Ontario are not even meeting the baseline standard. And if you often talk to math teachers, they will often suggest that the standard itself isn't high enough. That's on top of results that were record low for reading, writing, and math in general. Those results were on the heels of US data from the AMC that US high school graduates had the lowest competency levels in math and English in history. So it's a very alarming trend. And there was an excellent article by an educator this week at the AMC that used the term systemic failure, that these results aren't just a byproduct of COVID, because results like this don't just happen overnight. They've likely been building and building over time, and we're simply at a threshold. And that's not to say anything negative about the incredible work teachers do day in, day out. You know, a teacher in Ontario has over 30 kids in a class. In that class, you might have 5 to 6 different learning levels. And, you know, most people might not even realize a teacher isn't provided with curriculum support. So, you know, the math curriculum was changed last September, and teachers in Ontario are now obliged to teach coding, and there's no textbook, there's no lesson plan. And, you know, I ask anyone on the call, if you had to teach someone coding and it wasn't your expertise, how could you possibly do that? It's actually quite an impossible endeavor.
It's disheartening, to say the least, especially in light of what you described, Joel. We all have our personal stories of tribulations and trials over the course of our lockdowns with kids. And the idea of trying to discover and nurture enrichment opportunities for kids who aren't meeting their potential. I mean, I can even speak for myself. I think I don't have any steam left in the tank, you know? So I know that a lot of us are looking for other opportunities to, as we say, fill those gaps. And Vanessa, you know, you were in a situation where you were able to be proactive about meeting Marco's learning needs, but is it safe to say that you may have even started that sooner if you spotted some of the signs that he wasn't meeting his potential?
Absolutely. I think for me personally, I'm a big believer in, you know, balanced kids. I wasn't the type of mom, to be perfectly honest, to put my own son in enrichment programs when he was growing up. And, you know, I felt I should let him develop as he would. That's how I grew up. That was my experience. That was my husband's experience. And so I wished I had really started earlier. The number one reason for that isn't even the grades or landing at a great high school, but the confidence that I saw in my son when he believed that he had something to offer the world.
When we get more into that. Yeah, that's quite an incredible shift and a really important one, especially now. But let's talk a little bit more, or let's start talking about some of the characteristics and signs. This is where we'll talk a little bit about those profiles that you heard about in the introduction. Joel, can you take us through some of the signs and characteristics that we might see in a child who could be high achieving but isn't meeting his potential, his or her potential?
So Sarah, I'm not sure if you realize this, but you're asking me a very difficult question.
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Go.
So I'm going to try to answer it in a sophisticated way. Okay. I think that disengagement from learning would be the most reliable indicator. But as we are going to see, right, disengagement can be a very, very tricky, very difficult thing to detect, because as we all know, students learn very differently, right? They have different needs. They, you know, follow different, different types of learning appeal to them, and so on and so forth. Okay. Now it sounds to me, Vanessa, that with reference to your son Marco, disengagement was reflected largely through the low grades that he received.
Yes.
So that's really interesting, because in the case of my son, Adam, disengagement was reflected in a very, very different way that I hope highlights the complexity of the question. So the way Adam disengaged was in rushing his homework and his schoolwork all the time, right? So I would ask Adam, how was schoolwork? And he said, oh, it was great. And I was like, okay, how long did it take you to do, your 10 math problems? Oh, it took me about 5 minutes. And I was like, wow, you must be a genius in math. And then he showed me his handout, and I could detect the problems, very quickly. And over time, I realized that with Adam specifically, he wanted to do his schoolwork, not because he was really engaged or really interested in the learning aspect, but he was much more concerned with trying to please his teacher. So here we have two examples of, real students, real examples of students who can disengage from learning for two very, very different reasons. So let me quickly now, in the interest of time, jump into the slide that hopefully we can all see in front of us. So these are 6 profiles, or 6 learner profile formulation that we are about to discuss appeared long ago in 1988 in an article called Revised Profiles of the Gifted and the Talented. And this piece of research was written by Neyhart and Betts. Now, in a nutshell, what these 2 researchers hoped to do in conducting this research was to find a good way to represent and measure how different gifted kids learn. That was the objective, okay? Now, let me stress that the 6 profiles on the slide here, these successful, creative, underground, at risk, twice exceptional, autonomous, these 6 profiles are categories. They're not children. That's a really important distinction to make, okay? These are simply categories, they're not children. So it would be a grave mistake, I think, to do what some of us, I think, are trying to do right now as we are looking at this slide, which is to squeeze our child into one of these profiles and go, okay, where does Marco fit, or where does Adam fit? And I'm going to suggest that this is a bad idea for 2 fairly obvious reasons. The first reason is that our children, as I'm sure we all know, are far more complex than categories. Okay, that's number 1. And number 2, a child's learning obviously changes over time, right? So we can see the limits of trying to see these categories as somehow avatars of individual students. They're really just a stepping stone or a starting point in trying to understand to a greater degree the needs of high potential learners.
So Joel, that's very important. And I know that everyone here, as you mentioned, has no interest jamming kids into boxes or categories. And even as I go through, I relate to your story about Adam. My son, Ben, is a rusher, and it's exactly the same, So I can go through and pick out a couple of different characteristics from different categories here that help me see, okay, well, sometimes this is how he is. Oh yeah, the bored, the creative, there's different things from different categories. So would you be able to tell us a little bit more about how these profiles can be useful to parents and why you think they're important for parents to know?
Okay, so I'm going to preface that by saying, again, that this is a piece of research, right? It wasn't really done with utility so much in mind, right? It was done for intellectual purposes. So that's the first observation that I want to make. But I am going to try to answer your question a little bit more helpfully. Again, I think that, the profiles are simply less useful than the characteristics that are displayed in each. And I think that if we can go, as you were suggesting, right, through these categories, across the profiles and create a tailored profile for our unique child, and this is something that we would have to do not once, but on several points in the process of their education, right? I think that we are going to be able to understand why our high potential child might be disengaging from learning. So that's the first benefit. And the second is, it might give us an impetus to seek out the right kind of opportunities for re-engaging those children.
Do you think we could, Vanessa, I know you've got control of the slides there. Do you think we could just quickly look at an expanded version of a couple of these profiles?
Sure.
And maybe you could use that as a way to illustrate what you're saying here, Joel.
Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Maybe I should use Adam again as my guinea pig.
Sure, sounds good.
Use, Adam as my guinea pig in these instances. So before I do that, let me just sort of explain very briefly, or maybe I should phrase this differently. Let me try to interpret what we see on this slide so that we know what we are looking at. So on the left, right, what we see are some of the issues or problems that very often bar a hypothetical student from learning effectively and achieving their full potential. Okay. So here we see behavioral engagement, social engagement, affective engagement, and cognitive engagement, right? And on the left, that was on the left. On the right side of the slide, we can see or identify a number of sort of remedial solutions to the issues and problems that have been identified. Okay, again, in the case of this hypothetical creative student, right? So let's apply this to Adam very quickly. Okay? So when I look at, when I think carefully about Adam and I look at these categories, behavioral, affective, cognitive, social, and I'm focusing here on behavioral for a minute, right? I can see questions, teachers, and questions, rules. That is Adam in a T, right? If these characteristics were the only characteristics on this slide, I would have gone, that's it. My son is a creative, right? Is in this category of a creative learner. However, I look at social engagement and I see may conflict with peers. Adam is petrified of any kind of conflict, and he tries to avoid it at every turn. I shouldn't say this because my wife is in the house. He's like my wife. Right? Seeks to fit in as a classroom clown. Maybe sometimes, not always, right? Let's look now at the first slide for a second. I don't want to take up too much time, okay? So successful, right? Let's just for the sake of it, look at the success. So yes, this one, exactly, thank you. So again, let's look at behavior engagement, needs teacher approval. That's exactly what I said 2 minutes ago about Adam, right? He does his homework for that purpose, right? Not so much for learning, but because he craves that, oh, you're wonderful, Adam. You really succeeded today. He just craves that, okay? So that works. Extrinsically motivated as opposed to intrinsically motivated. Yes, right? We see a correlation between these two things. Now, is he a conformist? He is not a conformist, right? He enjoys pleasing his, his teachers, but he is someone who thinks independently. He's someone who doesn't go with the flow. He swims against the flow in most cases. So there's no need to dwell on this anymore. I think that the point is fairly clear, right? Let's do the smart thing here together. Let's do the homework, the groundwork, so to speak. Let's really try to understand what the learning needs of our kids are and try to make use of this schema to the best of our capacity, because I think that it will at least make us more aware of the needs of our kids, and then we'll be able to support them better.
So Joel, all of us are going to find hybrid profiles for our kids. What then is the best use of it? Now, there's examples on the right-hand side, as you mentioned, about some ideas that might be helpful to respond to particular traits to, bring out the high potential in the learner. But what is the next? And by the way, I do believe that all of these slides and this information will be available to the participants, right? I think that's, so if you want some time to go through them and make your own hybrid, that's your time. But so what do you do next? And this is not, I want to talk more about the instruction, but just as a parent, I'm looking at this, okay, I have this hybrid model. What can I do at that point?
So I think that this is where it gets a little bit more tricky, just in terms of the fact that there's just more work to be done on the part, of the parent. In an ideal world, right, I think that this information is far more relevant to teachers, because I think that instructors and teachers, again, in an ideal world, could use this information in order to better understand the needs of their students, and then be able to cater to them.
So one thing then, I think a way a parent could use this is, we as parents have the opportunity to see more clearly when we have these characteristics in front of us. And that is something that you could potentially bring to, in a forum where you'll be able to have a one-on-one conversation with the educator. Look, this is what I'm seeing. I'd like to do, what can we do together? Given that we're out of steam, given, all of the context that we're in right now, but I could see that as something that would be helpful. I wanted to clarify something, because you mentioned that the research is sort of to help define gifted kids, but, I'm a little wary of that label in particular. Are we talking only about kids that are labeled gifted or should be labeled gifted based on this test, XYZ test? Or is this, this does fit high potential learners in general? Can you just clarify that for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think the definitions can be very, very tricky. Okay? The sole reason why I use the term gifted in this instance is because those are the terms of the article, right? And the researchers define gifted as achieving 10% above standardized, tests. There's no real reference in the article to what those tests are, and so on and so forth. But that's besides the point, right? When we talk about high potential, right, that's also a term that needs to be defined, right? At Brain Power, right, we defined that, right, as being able to learn effectively, 2 or 3 grades above ministry standards. And at Brain Power, we have assessments where we do that, right? But I think that in this instant, definitions are less important. It's more about going through the process of trying to better understand what your child needs.
Right.
The label and the the label and the definition here, I think, is really less important, because the objective is to try and help, try and support our kids, right, as much as possible in this climate.
Yeah, and I wanted to make that clarification though, because if parents are thinking, oh, this applies to gifted kids and my child didn't make the mark or something, then this doesn't, it does apply to kids, as we've talked about, that are potentially high achieving and are not meeting it. So let's figure out what's going on and how to deal with that. Vanessa, when you're going through and seeing these different characteristics, are there any that quickly jump to mind for you about that would have fit Marco, that would have helped you get him the assistance that he could have used earlier on?
Yeah, no, absolutely. In this profile right here, for example, one thing about Marco is he's very self-critical, and as I mentioned, has a natural tendency to underachieve. And so something that a teacher did that was fantastic after we discovered that this was an issue with Marco is really providing him an opportunity to demonstrate leadership. And for him, given his interest in World War II history, that meant he was interviewed a war veteran in front of the whole school on Remembrance Day, and was noted for that ability to get up and tell that story and do a presentation in front of the whole school. And I just can't tell you how much that increased his confidence, because it made him feel valued, and it connected probably for him where he might not have been as engaged in the texts they might have been reading in school. It connected what he was naturally interested in with school, and suddenly something linked there, and he realized that he was able to outperform, for lack of a better term, and he was able to be a leader. And I think before then he felt, well, if I'm not interested in fill in the blank, whatever the specific curriculum was, then I am then therefore not a leader. Right. And so that was a great example. Another example I know for sure is creative kids. I think a lot of this, we hear this a lot of brain power. Creative kids are readily bored. And the idea of giving them an innovative opportunity to express themselves, much like the example that I just shared. He was really interested in Star Wars Lego, and he decided to start a whole YouTube channel. And I have to say that if that had been a different subject matter or a different format, if he had to do a traditional speech, he probably wouldn't have put so much effort and heart into it. But I have to say, I was just thoroughly impressed by how well he thought it through, how well this, the outcome was, because it was something innovative and challenging, and it really tapped into his interest, but his desire to be innovative. It like sparked something.
So it's really about finding the opportunities that match, the needs, basically, right?
Absolutely.
I wanted you to speak a little bit more, we don't have a ton of time and I want to get to the next section, but a little bit more about how the educator that you brought on board helped to address the needs that you were able to start outlining for Marco.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say there was two real standout tactics. One was she told Marco that he could achieve whatever he wanted in the world, that he was smart. And I know we live in a culture where there's some backlash against this idea where everyone gets a trophy, and there truly are different capability levels, but this was my child and no one had ever told him that. So it opened a door, whether it was true or not, it opened that door, and he felt open to the idea of being academically advanced. And so that was one tactic. I think the next tactic, which for me was very eye-opening, is simply really utilizing feedback the way a sports coach would. So if anyone on the webinar who's ever played a competitive sport, I know I did, I was a skater, you know, you practice, you fall, you get advice on, you know, how to throw the ball better, and then you try again and you try again. And so, you know, especially with boys, I think, you know, what you hear is they often don't express themselves in writing. So, you know, Marco would do a composition. He would actually get a debrief on his composition that was very, 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 very detailed by a PhD level faculty member or instructor. And then he would actually have to utilize that feedback and submit another draft and iterate and go on and on and on. And actually, Joel will tell you that is one of the aspects of brain power that we firmly believe in, the idea of iterative feedback. And I know most of the folks on the call are parents of younger kids, but this applies even to the most young child who's just learning how to write a sentence or the alphabet. The idea that we learn from acting on feedback provided, and that there is a continuous growth learning loop. That I think was a really, really big differentiator. And to be honest, a teacher can't possibly iterate in that way in a classroom with 30 kids and a massive curriculum to get through. It's quite literally impossible.
So go ahead, Joel.
Sorry, can I just jump in there? Because I think that Vanessa is touching upon the core, I think, of BrainPower's approach, BrainPower's curriculum. The one other element that I think is really important beyond the reiterative component, and that is Socratic questioning. From a very young age, we pose questions not to get an answer, but to stimulate the thinker to pose another question and another relevant question in order to be able to understand the issue or the problem that they're facing. And there are some skeptics out there that think that only, 14 or 15-year-old students have the capability of doing that and doing that well. That's a fallacy. I've been teaching at BrainPower for nearly 10 years, and I do that with my elementary 2 class, right? Young kids. And they do that incredibly well once they understand the tool and how to apply that tool. So I just wanted to jump in to emphasize that other aspect of our pedagogy that I think that is incredibly important.
Yeah, and I'd like you to say a little bit more, Joel. For those who don't know, Joel is a scholar of Shakespeare who also teaches school-age children. So, when Vanessa talked about her own experience, you elaborated a little bit. What can you tell us about your own approach to teaching when we're talking about school-age kids?
Right. So, the first thing I want to say is that Vanessa's experience really moves me. And it moves me to the core for a very simple reason. I've seen the same experience echoed over and over and over and over again at BrainPower with my own students. Students who were told by a principal or by teachers that they are less than because of this, that, and the other. And it's crushing. It is crushing. I'm sure that Marco must have told Vanessa at some point that it's not a nice feeling, right? And I'm going to also, confess here that I was one of those children. 35 years ago, I was one of those children. And I get a bit emotional by saying this. A child that was told, you won't amount to very much. So I get very moved by, stories like that. Excuse my getting a little bit emotional here.
Oh, what, Joel, I relate. I went through something very similar and was pulled out of a class when I was in math, grade 12, and teacher said, you're not good at this, don't do it. And, I think I was a little bit more of a jerk. So I said, yeah, watch me. So I decided to major in it. And I
Right.
had no plan of doing
Hi,
anything.
everyone. I
but-
just wanted to step in. It's Sarah from Kids and Company.
Yes.
We have about 15 minutes left. So if we want to answer any questions or guide the conversation in that direction, I just wanted to let you both know.
Okay, we're going to finish up a couple of points here. I want Joel to say a bit more about his experience as an instructor, and then we can move on to some questions.
So I'm going to go through this quickly in the interest of time. So I reflect, obviously, a lot about my teaching. So I would say that at the very core, my teaching method is about familiarizing myself first and foremost with my students' learning needs. And that may seem like a very trivial thing, but it isn't. It takes a lot of work. And if we have the time, I'm going to outline that process. But I think that is perhaps the most important thing, is for an instructor to be able to take the time to familiarize themselves with their students' needs. Then I think it is about guiding students to make sure, and there's a huge responsibility in this, to reach their full potential so that they can contribute something to the world. This may sound like a lofty goal, but for me, that is the ultimate measure of success. If you're able to do something that makes a difference, whether it is in the community, whether it is, to industry, whether it is, to science, to the humanities, right? And I think that you need to cultivate the right frame of mind for that to happen, okay? At its core, we do that by helping students acquire a strong skill set in critical thinking first, then in language skills, and in math, okay? And the last thing I think that is really important and is very often neglected is the importance of recognizing that there's a huge amount of pressure placed on young kids with education becoming far more competitive. So there is a need to really understand how we build their confidence over time so that they can deal better than I dealt, with a situation that a teacher told me that I was less than. And I could not be an academic because of A, B, and C, right? So those, are the pillars, I think, of my education philosophy. I could sort of illustrate how, this work has worked in the past with a particular student, but I don't know if we have the time.
Well, would you be able to say a couple of things about that?
Okay, why don't I try and do this quickly?
Sure.
Okay, because I think that it is, an important, way to kind of illustrate, some of the points that I made. So several years ago, I had a student by the name of Anna who attended one of my language arts courses. Now, this student was incredibly bright. There was no doubt in my mind, but she was also impossibly distracted in class. And very often, she sort of pushed back. Whenever I said something, I felt that she was just being a little bit antagonistic. And that marked her experience and my experience at the very start of the year for the first maybe 5-6 weeks. Now, I did notice that something clicked in her mind when Halloween, this time of year, came around, right? And the spooky and unnerving stories that we read at Brainpower struck a real chord with her. I could see that she was clearly fascinated by, insanity, the macabre, the dark aspects of life, because she wrote, and I promise you that I'm not exaggerating, hundreds of brilliant, dark little poems that she shared with me every week after class in this tome that she brought. Right? Now, I told her about the fact that I know a little bit about the literary Gothic tradition. I know a little bit about the works of Mary Shelley and Edgar Allan Poe. And through this conversation, our interaction blossomed, right? And our connection became really strong. So I just want to break down very quickly what it is that I did as an instructor. So I began by tapping into the student's interest, okay? Then what I did was I cultivated that interest by engaging with that student about her poetry every week. And then slowly doing my own homework, trying to find works that she might be interested in, works of art, works of poetry, works of fiction. I started to broaden her intellectual horizons, right? And over time, we built such a rapport together that I think almost, by way of magic, Anna's behavioral issues improved tremendously. And I think that was the time, maybe the very specific point that I realized that I was much more a mentor to these students rather than an instructor.
Right. That's incredible. And I think, we have the slide up right now, Vanessa, and I'm seeing that just about everything that Joel talked about in that story reflects what we're seeing here in enriched learning experiences.
Right, exactly. And, these are the 5 criteria that we use at Brainpower to build our programs. However, we did not invent these categories, for lack of a better term. There's research behind all of them. So, for anyone who's read Angela Duckworth or Carol Dweck, the idea of feedback, which you'll see in the green there, is absolutely critical. So, it's a fact. Kids who believe talents are fixed grow at a slower rate than those who believe in a growth mindset and receive specific feedback that they have to implement. We also know that 60% of high potential kids underachieve based on their potential. That's often because highly motivated, high potential kids need more complex learning activities. And I think what Joel just described there, that student would not have done well with rote worksheets, rote vocabulary worksheets would not have engaged that student. She needed the complexity of this multi-genre writing, listening, type of activity. And, we can go through the other ones as well, but these are really the 5 keys that we believe provide kids with enriched learning experiences. So above.
Sorry, Vanessa, but just in the interest of time, one final question, and then I'll pass it back to the other Sarah. So, we've talked about how Brainpower and this type of learning can bridge the gaps in our education system. But, how do you see this as setting high potential underachieving learners onto a path to success in, what's frankly a pretty uncertain looking world and future right now?
Yeah, and that's a fantastic question. And I think one of the biggest challenges of education today is, I think everyone will agree, the pace of change in the world has never been faster. We have no idea what world our kids today, for those on the webinar, you have, 5-year-olds, we have no idea what world they will be graduating into, but we do know that critical thinking and problem-solving skills are the core foundational skills we need to equip these kids with for success in life and also for well-being. And, rote learning or learning how to code Scratch, that is a tool, that is a technical knowledge acquisition. Learning how to use logic to solve a problem, that will always set up a child for success in a STEM-related field. And so there's a difference between foundational critical thinking, problem-solving skills that are broadly applicable. This was supposed to be the point of university, and we've really veered into, acquiring a specific knowledge or specific tactical knowledge instead, right? And so I think that is what, as parents, we should all be focused on.
I'll just very quickly jump in because I just want to highlight one other thing very quickly. Vanessa, mentioned a number of very important skills. I also think that we need to think beyond academics here. We need to think about how we fashion our kids into becoming citizens of the world. Kids who know what their values are, kids who know how to pursue their passions. That's something that doesn't happen very often. I hear from my students, I love to do this and I don't, I love doing that. And then I ask them, okay, so what have you done in order to exercise those passions, to fulfill those passions? Oh, I don't really know what to do, right? So I think that we need to give them a little bit of a helping hand in order to think about what kind of people they're going to be in 20 years, right? And I think that would really complement some of the more technical skills that Vanessa mentioned.
Thanks, everybody. And Sarah, back to you.
Thank you, Sarah. So we want to just thank Dr. Joel and Sarah and Vanessa so much for this informative session. It was really wonderful, and we really appreciate all of your insight on the 6 profiles of high potential learners and how to identify them and their unique learning needs. We had a few questions in the chat box below. However, though, a lot of them are being answered right now. But one question was, how early can children start the programs at Brainpower?
Right, and so I just answered, thanks for the question. Our programs do begin in grade 1. Because we are assessment-based, you don't have to be in grade 1. So, our Math Masters grade 1 program, if your child is an SK and assesses in, they can join us. So we often say, SK is the right level to be assessed.
Wonderful. And is there anything specific, Vanessa and the team, that you want to share before we leave our audience today?
Sorry, I was on mute. I didn't realize. I was going to say, Vanessa, could you put on the slide that directs people where to go for more information if other questions come up in the meantime?
For sure. So I certainly encourage you to use the materials we've shared with your own kids. And if you're interested in Brainpower, we have 3 campuses in Toronto, as well as a virtual campus. And our phone number, website, and email are posted. We do book assessments for kids SK or older and provide referrals for gifted testing for those interested in gifted testing. But our programs are generally in the areas of problem solving and logic and various communication skills, including public speaking, which is quite popular. So certainly hope that you reach out to us, but more so, I hope that you learn something about how to better connect with and engage your child. That's really our biggest mission at Brainpower, is to make a difference in that regard.
Wonderful. So we'd like to thank you on behalf of Kids and Company for joining us today. And we'd like to remind all of our participants that there will be a follow-up email of the recording of today's session and other materials that Brainpower will share. So thank you, everyone, for joining us and attending today's session. And we hope that you have a wonderful day. Thanks, Brainpower. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, Kids and Company.
Bye.
Bye-bye.